The morning of December 16, 1944, broke through the darkness of the Ardennes forest with temperatures hovering near 0 degrees Fahrenheit. In the pre-dawn hours, American soldiers stationed along what had been considered a quiet sector of the Western Front were about to face the perfect storm of military disaster and natural catastrophe. What would unfold over the next 6 weeks would become the bloodiest battle American forces fought in World War II, claiming 19,000 American lives. While German bullets, artillery shells, and tank rounds would account for most of these deaths, the savage winter conditions would prove to be a relentless killer in its own right, with cold weather contributing to thousands of casualties through exposure, frostbite, and the deadly breakdown of the human body in temperatures that plunged to 20 below zero. As these young Americans prepared to face death in the frozen forests of Belgium and Luxembourg, their families back home were hanging Christmas stockings, shopping for presents, and preparing holiday feasts. The contrast between the warm glow of American living rooms and the frozen foxholes of the Ardennes could not have been more stark. While mothers baked sugar cookies in kitchens filled with the scent of cinnamon and pine, their sons were watching their fingers turn black from frostbite. While children tore open presents on Christmas morning, soldiers were cutting the boots off dead comrades because their own footwear had disintegrated in the wet snow, and their feet were beginning to freeze. The winter of 1944 to 1945 was the coldest Europe had experienced in over 3 decades. This was not merely uncomfortable weather. This was killing cold, the kind that stops blood from flowing to extremities, that turns exposed skin to leather, that makes men choose between taking off their gloves to fire their weapons and keeping their fingers from freezing solid. The Ardennes forest, with its dense woods, steep ravines, and narrow roads, had always been considered difficult terrain. Add to this the heaviest snowfall in memory, temperatures that regularly dropped to -10 Fahrenheit, and you had conditions that would kill men just as surely as enemy fire. Private Donald Vergett of the 101st Airborne Division would later describe the cold as a living thing that hunted them through the forest. He wrote about how it crept into their foxholes at night, seeping through every layer of clothing, finding every gap in their defenses against it. The cold didn't just make them uncomfortable, it made them stupid. It slowed their thinking, made their movements clumsy, turned simple tasks like loading ammunition into complex challenges that could cost lives. Men would fall asleep on guard duty not from exhaustion, but from the insidious way extreme cold shuts down the human body, and they would never wake up. The American forces in the Ardennes were not prepared for this kind of winter warfare. Many units had been rushed to the front with inadequate winter clothing. The standard issue uniform was designed for mobility, not for sitting in a foxhole when the temperature dropped to 20 below. Soldiers stuffed newspapers into their jackets, wrapped burlap sacks around their feet, and stole tablecloths from abandoned Belgian homes to use as extra blankets. They learned to urinate on their hands to warm them momentarily, a desperate measure that provided seconds of relief from the numbing cold. Technical Sergeant William Roberts, from the 28th Infantry Division, described how men would huddle together like animals in their foxholes, abandoning any pretense of military bearing and the desperate need for warmth. They would rotate positions, with the man on the outside moving to the middle every hour, sharing body heat in a primitive attempt at survival. But even this wasn't enough when the temperature dropped and the wind picked up, cutting through the forest with a sound Roberts said was like the screaming of the damned. The morning the German offensive began, many American units were caught completely off guard. The 106th Infantry Division, newly arrived in Europe, had been placed in this quiet sector to gain experience. These green troops, many of them teenagers who had never seen combat, suddenly faced not only the veteran German divisions pouring through the forest, but also weather conditions that would have challenged Arctic explorers. Within the first 3 days, entire regiments of the 106th would be surrounded and forced to surrender, not just because of German military superiority, but because men were freezing to death in their positions, their weapons frozen solid, their ability to resist compromised by the cold that was shutting down their bodies. The cold affected every aspect of military operations. Tank engines had to be started every 30 minutes throughout the night, or they would freeze solid and never start again. This meant crews had to expose themselves to enemy fire constantly, just to keep their vehicles operational. Gasoline turned to jelly in fuel tanks. Oil became as thick as molasses. Batteries died within hours. Radio communications failed as the cold sapped power from their batteries and made the metal components brittle and prone to breaking. Medical treatment became a nightmare in these conditions. Plasma froze solid and had to be thawed under medics' armpits before it could be administered. Morphine syrettes had to be kept in mouth to prevent freezing. Wounded men who might have survived with prompt treatment died because the cold accelerated shock and blood loss. A man hit in the leg by shrapnel might not die from the wound itself, but from the hypothermia that set in as he lay in the snow waiting for evacuation that could take hours or days in the chaos of the battle. Captain Joseph Marshall, a medical officer with the 4th Infantry Division, described scenes that belonged more to the Napoleonic retreat from Moscow than to modern warfare. He saw men whose feet had frozen solid inside their boots, the flesh dead and black. When they finally got these soldiers to aid stations and cut off their boots, the toes would sometimes come off with them, frozen solid like pieces of charcoal. The smell of gangrene mixed with the sharp scent of winter air became something Marshall would never forget, a combination that would make him physically ill decades later when he encountered it again in civilian practice. Back home, Americans were following the battle through newspaper headlines and radio reports, but the true horror of what their soldiers were experiencing was hidden from them. Censorship prevented the most graphic descriptions from reaching the home front. Families gathering around their radios after Christmas dinner heard about heavy fighting and difficult conditions, but they couldn't imagine their sons and husbands trying to eat sea rations that had frozen solid, that had to be thawed in their mouths bite by bite, or going days without hot food because field kitchens couldn't operate in the extreme cold. The psychological impact of the cold was as devastating as its physical effects. Soldiers described a particular kind of despair that came with the constant, unrelenting cold. It wore them down, hour by hour, day by day, until some men simply gave up. They would stop trying to stay warm, stop eating, stop fighting. This condition, which medics called give-up-itis, was a form of psychological surrender to the elements. Men would sit down in the snow and refuse to move, accepting death as preferable to continued suffering. Staff Sergeant Robert Rader of the 82nd Airborne Division watched one of his squad members, a tough kid from Minnesota who should have been used to cold weather, simply sit down during a march and announce he was done. No amount of threats, pleading, or physical force could get him to move. He sat there in the snow, eyes vacant, as his body temperature dropped. They had to leave him behind when German artillery started falling, and when they came back, he was dead, frozen in a sitting position, his rifle still across his lap, looking like some terrible statue commemorating the waste of war. The Battle of the Bulge saw innovations in trying to combat the cold that were born of desperation. Soldiers learned to put their socks inside their shirts against their skin while sleeping, using their body heat to dry them out. They discovered that wearing 2 pairs of socks could actually make their feet colder if it made their boots too tight and cut off circulation. They learned to keep moving their toes constantly, even in sleep, to maintain blood flow. They developed a buddy system where men would check each other's faces every few minutes for the white patches that indicated frostbite. The most vulnerable were the wounded. A soldier hit during an attack might lie in the snow for hours before medics could reach him. The cold would slow his bleeding, which might save his life, but it would also begin shutting down his organs. Medics described finding wounded men who were still alive but whose bodies had already begun the process of freezing. Their skin would be hard to the touch, their eyes glazed with ice crystals, their breathing so shallow it was almost imperceptible. Many of these men died not from their wounds, but from hypothermia that set in while they waited for rescue. Private First Class John Klein, from the 2nd Infantry Division, was hit by machine gun fire on December 18th. He fell into a shell hole filled with snow and ice water. For 6 hours he lay there, the lower half of his body submerged in freezing water. playing dead when German patrols passed by. When American forces retook the position and found him, his legs were frozen solid. He survived the war but lost both legs below the knee. In a letter to his wife from the hospital, he wrote that he was grateful to be alive, but that sometimes in his dreams, he was still in that shell hole, feeling the cold creeping up his body, stealing his legs inch by inch. The phenomenon of trench foot, which had plagued armies in World War I, returned with a vengeance in the Ardennes. This condition, caused by prolonged exposure to wet and cold conditions, could cripple a man as effectively as a bullet. Feet would swell, turn black, and begin to rot. The pain was excruciating, described by sufferers as feeling like their feet were being held in a fire, while simultaneously being stabbed with needles. Entire units became combat ineffective, not from enemy action, but from trench foot casualties. By December 23rd, a week into the battle, some American units were reporting 50% casualties from cold weather injuries. These weren't minor ailments. Men were losing fingers, toes, ears, and noses to frostbite. The 30th Infantry Division alone reported over 500 cases of trench foot in a single week. Each of these casualties required evacuation and treatment, putting additional strain on medical services already overwhelmed by combat wounds. The cold created tactical problems that military planners had not anticipated. Soldiers couldn't dig foxholes in ground, frozen solid as concrete. Engineer units had to use explosives to blast holes in the earth, giving away positions to the enemy. The snow, while providing some concealment, also made movement incredibly difficult. A simple march that might take an hour in normal conditions could take 4 hours through knee-deep snow. Units became separated, lost in the white maze of the forest. Some men simply wandered off into the snow and were never seen again. Lieutenant Robert Edwards of the 9th Infantry Division described leading a patrol through the forest at night. The snow was falling so heavily they couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. The cold was so intense that their compass froze and became useless. They navigated by instinct, stumbling through the darkness, each man holding onto the belt of the man in front of him to avoid getting separated. When dawn came, they discovered they had walked in a circle and were back where they started, exhausted and frostbitten, having accomplished nothing except surviving another night. The irony of the situation was not lost on the soldiers. Here they were, fighting to liberate Europe, to bring freedom to oppressed peoples, and they were dying not heroically in battle, but freezing to death in foxholes, their bodies shutting down degree by degree. Some men kept diaries, and their entries from this period are filled with bitter observations about the nature of their suffering. One soldier wrote that he had joined the army to kill Nazis, not to have his feet turn black and fall off. The cold didn't discriminate between friend and foe. German soldiers were suffering just as badly, though many of them had more experience with winter conditions from fighting on the Eastern Front, but even they were unprepared for the severity of this particular winter. Captured German soldiers often begged American medics to treat their frostbite before their wounds, knowing that the cold injuries would cripple them for life while a bullet wound might heal. Supply lines became critical lifelines in these conditions. The famous Siege of Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne Division held out against German forces, became as much about surviving the cold as fighting the enemy. When the weather finally cleared enough for supply drops on December 23rd, the parachutes bringing ammunition, food, and medical supplies looked like Christmas presents falling from the sky. But even more important than the ammunition were the bundles containing socks, gloves, and winter clothing. Sergeant William Tucker was in Bastogne during the siege. He later described how they burned furniture from destroyed houses, broke up ammunition boxes for firewood, and even considered burning the bodies of dead Germans for warmth. The cold was so intense that men would risk sniper fire to search destroyed vehicles for anything that could provide insulation. Tucker saw a soldier get shot trying to retrieve a blanket from a burned-out German truck. As the man lay dying in the snow, his last words were that at least he wasn't cold anymore. The Quartermaster Corps performed miracles, trying to get winter supplies to the front lines. They requisitioned every piece of warm clothing they could find in Belgium and France. They stripped blankets from civilian homes, bought up entire stocks of wool socks from British suppliers, and flew in sleeping bags from England. But it was never enough. The scale of the battle and the severity of the weather outpaced their ability to supply adequate winter gear. Some units became creative in their desperate search for warmth. They discovered that captured German equipment was often better suited for winter conditions than American gear. German boots, designed for the Eastern Front, were highly prized. Their white camouflage suits not only provided concealment in the snow, but were also warmer than American uniforms. There are documented cases of American soldiers stripping dead Germans of their clothes, despite the risk of being mistaken for the enemy and shot by their own side. The cold affected morale in profound ways. Soldiers who had maintained their spirits through months of combat found themselves broken by the constant, grinding cold. Men wrote about dreaming of warm beds, hot showers, and simple comforts like being able to feel their feet. Some soldiers later admitted that they deliberately wounded themselves to escape the cold, shooting themselves in the foot or hand to get evacuated to a warm hospital. Private Anthony Caruso from New York wrote to his mother on Christmas Eve, though she wouldn't receive the letter until mid-January. He described trying to eat Christmas dinner, a special meal the army had attempted to provide, but the turkey was frozen solid and the gravy had turned to ice. He wrote about thinking of his family sitting around their dinner table warm and safe, and how he had to stop himself from crying because he knew the tears would freeze on his face. He told his mother not to worry about him, that he was fine, but his handwriting, shaky and irregular from the cold and exhaustion, told a different story. The breakdown of small unit cohesion became a serious problem as the battle wore on. Men who had fought together for months began to fracture under the stress of the cold. Arguments broke out over trivial things like who got to stand closest to a small fire, or who had to take the exposed position in a foxhole. The bonds that held units together, already strained by combat, were stretched to breaking by the constant misery of the cold. Some men became almost feral in their determination to survive. They would steal food and clothing from other units, even from wounded comrades. Military discipline, already difficult to maintain in combat conditions, became even harder to enforce when men were fighting for basic survival. Courts-martial after the battle included numerous cases of soldiers who had abandoned their posts, not from cowardice, but from a desperate search for warmth. The impact on junior officers was particularly severe. These young lieutenants and captains were responsible not just for their own survival, but for the welfare of their men. They had to make impossible decisions about when to attack, when to hold, when to withdraw, all while knowing that every minute spent in the open increased the risk of cold casualties. Many officers suffered nervous breakdowns, unable to bear the responsibility of sending men to die from exposure. Captain Harold Martin of the 4th Armored Division, part of Patton's relief force heading to Bastogne, described the moral weight of leadership in these conditions. He had to order his men to leave their vehicles and advance on foot through waist-deep snow under enemy fire. He watched them struggle forward, some falling from enemy bullets, others simply collapsing from exhaustion and cold. He knew that even those who survived the attack would suffer permanent damage from frostbite. The guilt of these decisions would haunt him for the rest of his life. The role of medics and medical personnel during the battle cannot be overstated. These men worked in impossible conditions, trying to save lives while fighting off the cold themselves. They performed surgeries in aid stations where water froze in surgical bowls, where blood plasma had to be warmed against their bodies before use, where surgical instruments had to be heated to prevent them from freezing to exposed tissue. One medic, Private Eugene Rose, described amputating frozen toes with a pair of surgical scissors because they had run out of scalpels. He worked for 36 straight hours during the height of the battle, his hands so cold he could barely hold his instruments. He saved dozens of lives but lost 3 fingers to frostbite himself. Years later, he would say that the cold was a more relentless enemy than the Germans, because you couldn't shoot back at it, couldn't take cover from it, couldn't negotiate with it. The evacuation of casualties became a logistical nightmare in the winter conditions. Ambulances couldn't navigate the icy roads. Jeeps fitted with stretchers would slip off roads and overturn, sometimes killing already wounded men. Soldiers had to carry their wounded comrades for miles through deep snow, a task that would exhaust them and often resulted in the bearers becoming casualties themselves from exposure. There are documented cases of wounded men begging to be left behind rather than slow down their units. Staff Sergeant James Miller of the 82nd Airborne was hit in the stomach on December 20th. As his squad tried to carry him to safety through the snow, he repeatedly told them to leave him, that he was dying anyway and they were risking their lives for nothing. They refused to abandon him, carrying him for 6 hours through a blizzard. Miller survived, but 2 of the men carrying him suffered such severe frostbite that they were evacuated and never returned to combat. The Germans had their own problems with the cold, but they used it tactically when they could. They would attack during blizzards, when American soldiers couldn't see more than a few yards. They would infiltrate positions at night, knowing that American sentries were likely to be huddled in whatever shelter they could find, rather than maintaining proper watch. The cold became a weapon that both sides tried to wield while simultaneously being victimized by it. The forest itself became an enemy in the cold. Trees weighted down with snow and ice would suddenly crack and fall, crushing men in their foxholes. The sound of breaking branches in the night would trigger firefights as nervous soldiers shot at shadows and sounds. The forest floor, covered in snow, hid roots, holes, and streams that could trap and injure men. Soldiers described the forest as a living thing that was trying to kill them, using the cold as its primary weapon. Wildlife in the Ardennes suffered alongside the soldiers. Deer, driven from their normal habitat by the fighting, would wander into military positions, sometimes triggering alerts or being shot for food. Birds fell frozen from trees. Even the hardy forest wolves, normally avoiding humans, were seen scavenging among the dead. The entire ecosystem of the Ardennes was disrupted by the combination of violence and unprecedented cold. The engineers, tasked with keeping roads open and building bridges, faced unique challenges in the cold. Bailey bridges, the standard military bridge of the time, became death traps when covered with ice. Engineers had to constantly spread sand, ashes, anything they could find to provide traction. They worked with bare hands on frozen metal, leaving skin behind on every surface they touched. Their casualty rate from cold exposure was among the highest of any branch. Sergeant Thomas Wilson, an engineer with the 291st Engineered Combat Battalion, described trying to build a bridge across a stream while under enemy fire. The water was so cold that men could only work in it for minutes at a time before having to be pulled out. They rotated teams constantly, but still, several men went into shock from the cold and had to be evacuated. The bridge that should have taken 4 hours to build took 14 hours, and by the time it was finished, half his platoon was combat ineffective from exposure. The impact on armor units was particularly severe. Tank crews faced a terrible choice between staying buttoned up inside their vehicles, where they had limited visibility and were vulnerable to ambush, or keeping hatches open for better visibility while exposing themselves to the killing cold. Tank commanders who rode with their heads out of the turret often suffered severe frostbite to their faces. There are recorded cases of tank commanders whose faces were so badly frostbitten that they were unrecognizable to their own crews. Inside the tanks wasn't much better. The metal vehicles became ice boxes, conducting cold rather than providing shelter from it. Crews would stuff every gap with cloth, paper, anything to stop the wind from getting in. They learned to wrap their hands in cloth before touching any metal surface to avoid having their skin freeze to it. Loaders' hands would freeze to ammunition shells. Drivers couldn't feel the controls through their frozen gloves. The artillery faced its own unique challenges in the cold. Gun oil turned to glue, making it difficult to operate breech mechanisms. Shells had to be cleaned of ice before loading. The ground was so frozen that the recoil from firing would sometimes cause guns to jump completely out of position. Forward observers, who had to remain stationary for long periods while directing fire, suffered terribly from exposure. Many were found frozen to death at their observation posts, their binoculars still raised to their eyes. Corporal Richard Davies, a forward observer with the 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion, spent 3 days in a church steeple during the siege of Bastogne, directing fire on German positions. He couldn't light a fire for fear of giving away his position. He couldn't move much for the same reason. By the time he was relieved, his feet were so badly frostbitten that he couldn't walk. He had to be lowered from the steeple with ropes and evacuated. He would spend the next 6 months in hospitals and would walk with a cane for the rest of his life. Communications became nearly impossible in the extreme cold. Field telephone wires became brittle and would snap at the slightest touch. Radio batteries died within hours. The cold affected radio crystals, throwing frequencies off and making communication unreliable. Runners had to be used to carry messages, exposing them to both enemy fire and the cold. Many messages never reached their destination because the runners collapsed from exhaustion or became lost in the snow-covered forest. The Signal Corps worked miracles trying to maintain communications. They learned to keep spare batteries warm by carrying them inside their clothing. They developed techniques for splicing frozen wires with numb fingers. They created relay stations where runners could warm up briefly before continuing with messages. But despite their efforts, units often found themselves isolated, cut off from higher command, fighting their own private wars in the frozen forest. The psychological warfare aspect of the cold cannot be underestimated. German propaganda broadcasts, particularly those by Axis Sally, would taunt American soldiers about freezing to death while their families enjoyed warm Christmas dinners. Leaflets were dropped, showing American soldiers frozen in the snow while their wives entertained other men by warm firesides back home. While most soldiers dismissed these as enemy propaganda, the constant cold made them more susceptible to demoralization. One particularly effective German tactic was to use loudspeakers to broadcast the sounds of warmth, recordings of crackling fires, running hot water, and people laughing in warm rooms. To men who hadn't been warm in weeks, these sounds were torture. Some units had to prohibit soldiers from listening, as it was affecting morale so badly. The Germans understood that the cold was breaking American spirits as effectively as their military attacks. As Christmas Day 1944 dawned, the contrast between the battlefield and the American home front reached its peak. In the States, families gathered around Christmas trees, children played with new toys, and radio stations played festive music. In the Ardennes, American soldiers were fighting for their lives in conditions that defied human endurance. While families said grace over turkey dinners, soldiers were trying to thaw frozen sea rations enough to eat them. While children built snowmen in their yards, soldiers were stacking frozen corpses like cordwood because the ground was too hard to dig graves. The army tried to maintain morale by providing Christmas dinners where possible. Some units managed to get hot turkey dinners to their men, though often the food was cold by the time it reached the front lines. Small Christmas trees were set up in aid stations and command posts. Chaplains held services in destroyed churches and forest clearings. But these attempts at normalcy only highlighted the abnormality of their situation. Private Robert Patterson wrote about attending a Christmas service in the ruins of a Belgian church. The chaplain's breath was visible as he spoke, and his words were occasionally drowned out by artillery fire. Half the congregation was wounded, wrapped in bloody bandages. They sang Silent Night while German shells exploded nearby, the irony not lost on anyone. Patterson wrote that it was the most meaningful and the most horrible Christmas service he had ever attended. The impact on Belgian civilians caught in the battle zone was devastating. Families were forced from their homes into the cold with whatever they could carry. Many took shelter in cellars, caves and forests, trying to survive both the battle and the weather. Children froze to death in their mothers' arms. Elderly people who had survived the German occupation died from exposure during the liberation. Entire villages were destroyed, their populations scattered to the winter winds. The Belgian town of L'Église became a particularly tragic example. As the battle raged around it, civilians huddled in cellars while their homes were destroyed above them. When they finally emerged, they found their town in ruins and dozens of their neighbors dead from cold and violence. One survivor, Marie Dupont, described finding her elderly parents frozen to death in their bed, having refused to leave their home despite the danger. They had survived 4 years of German occupation, only to die during their liberation. American soldiers often shared their rations and blankets with Belgian civilians, even when they barely had enough for themselves. There are countless stories of GIs giving their last pair of dry socks to Belgian children, or their only blanket to elderly civilians. This generosity, while admirable, sometimes resulted in American soldiers suffering increased cold injuries. But many soldiers later said that helping civilians gave them a sense of purpose beyond mere survival, reminded them why they were fighting. The delivery of supplies became an epic struggle against both the enemy and the elements. The famous Red Bull Express, the convoy system that supplied Allied forces, had to navigate roads turned into ice rinks, through forests where every tree might hide a German ambush, in vehicles not designed for such extreme conditions. Drivers would go days without sleep, taking Benzedrine to stay awake, their hands frozen to steering wheels, their feet numb on the pedals. Truck driver Private William Hayes described driving through a blizzard so severe he couldn't see the hood of his truck. He navigated by following the ruts in the snow, left by the vehicle ahead of him, praying it hadn't driven off a cliff. When he finally reached his destination after 18 hours of driving, he couldn't get out of his truck. His hands were frozen to the steering wheel and had to be pried loose by medics. He lost 3 fingers to frostbite, but was proud that he had delivered ammunition that helped save a surrounded unit. Air supply became critical when ground transportation failed. C-47 transport planes flew through terrible weather, often at treetop level to avoid German fighters, dropping supplies to surrounded units. These pilots and crews faced not just enemy fire but severe icing conditions that could bring down their aircraft in seconds. Many planes were lost not to enemy action but to weather, crashing into hillsides they couldn't see through the snow and fog. Flight Sergeant James Morrison flew 17 supply missions during the battle. He described ice forming on the wings so thick they could barely maintain altitude. On one mission, they had to throw out everything not essential, including their parachutes, to stay airborne. They flew through clouds so thick they couldn't see their own wingtips, navigating by instruments that were barely functioning in the cold. Morrison's plane was one of the lucky ones that made it back. Many didn't. The aftermath of battles in these conditions presented unique horrors. Bodies froze within minutes of death, creating grotesque sculptures of war. Soldiers described fields of frozen corpses, Americans and Germans mixed together, their last expressions preserved by the cold. Some bodies froze in fighting positions, rifles still aimed, creating an eerie tableau of warfare frozen in time. Graves registration units couldn't bury the dead because the ground was too hard, so bodies were stacked and covered with snow until the spring thaw. One Graves registration soldier, Private Eugene Cole, wrote about the surreal experience of collecting frozen bodies. They were like mannequins, he said, stiff and unnatural. Sometimes they would break when moved, arms or legs snapping off like branches. The cold preserved them, but also dehumanized them, turning young men into frozen objects. Cole suffered nightmares for years about a field full of frozen soldiers, standing upright in the positions where death had found them. The long-term effects of cold exposure during the Battle of the Bulge would affect veterans for the rest of their lives. Thousands of men suffered permanent nerve damage from frostbite. Others developed circulation problems that would plague them for decades. Arthritis, respiratory problems, and chronic pain were common among survivors. The Veterans Administration would treat cold-related injuries from the Battle of the Bulge for the next 70 years. Dr. Michael Rodriguez, who worked at a VA hospital in the 1960s, said that he could always identify Battle of the Bulge veterans by their feet, the distinctive scarring from frostbite, the missing toes, the discoloration, were unmistakable. These men, 20 years after the battle, still suffered from injuries inflicted by the cold. Many couldn't work jobs that required standing for long periods. Others couldn't tolerate even mildly cold weather without experiencing severe pain. The psychological scars were equally lasting. Veterans described a permanent aversion to cold weather, panic attacks triggered by snow, nightmares about freezing to death that persisted for decades. Many moved to warm climates after the war, unable to tolerate winter weather that reminded them of the Ardennes. The cold had traumatized them as deeply as combat, creating wounds that time couldn't heal. Robert Mason, a veteran of the 106th Infantry Division, couldn't look at snow without remembering the Ardennes. He moved to Arizona after the war, as far from winter as he could get. But even there, 50 years later, he would wake up on cold desert nights, believing he was back in his foxhole, frantically feeling for his rifle, checking his feet for frostbite. His wife learned to keep extra blankets on his side of the bed, understanding that for him cold meant death, even half a century removed from the battle. The Battle of the Bulge officially ended on January 25, 1945, when German forces were pushed back to their starting positions. The cost was staggering. The Americans suffered 89,000 casualties, including those 19,000 killed. While most died from combat wounds, the cold had been a constant accomplice to death, weakening men, slowing responses, and turning minor wounds into fatal ones. Thousands more suffered non-fatal cold injuries that would affect them for life. The statistics tell only part of the story. Behind each number was a young man who had left home to fight for his country and found himself in a frozen hell. Behind each casualty report was a family that would receive a telegram while winter still gripped America, learning that their son, husband, or father wouldn't be coming home. Behind each frostbite case was a man who would spend the rest of his life reminded of that terrible winter every time the temperature dropped. The battle changed how the American military thought about winter warfare. New cold weather equipment was developed, better training for Arctic conditions was implemented, and medical procedures for treating cold injuries were improved. But these lessons came too late for the men who fought in the Ardennes. In the winter of 1944, they had to learn through suffering, through trial and error, through the loss of fingers, toes, and lives. The heroism displayed during the battle went beyond combat courage. It included the medic who gave his gloves to a wounded soldier, knowing his own hands would freeze. It included the supply sergeant who drove through a blizzard to deliver blankets to a forward position. It included the lieutenant who gave up his place by the fire so his men could warm themselves. These acts of sacrifice, small and large, helped units survive when the cold threatened to destroy them as surely as German bullets. Corporal Anthony Martinez exemplified this heroism. During the worst of the cold snap, he noticed that one of his squad members, a young private from Alabama who had never experienced real winter, was showing signs of severe hypothermia. Martinez gave the younger soldier his own dry socks, his gloves, and his scarf. He then spent the next 12 hours making sure the private kept moving, kept eating, kept fighting the desire to sleep that would have meant death. Martinez lost 2 toes to frostbite, but he saved the private's life. Such stories were repeated thousands of times across the battlefield. The aftermath of the battle saw an outpouring of support from the American home front. When news of the conditions soldiers had faced became public, albeit in censored form, Americans sent millions of packages containing warm clothing, socks, gloves, and blankets to Europe. Churches organized knitting circles to make socks and scarves. Schools collected warm clothing. The response was too late to help during the battle itself, but it showed that Americans understood, at least partially, what their soldiers had endured. The contrast between the American response to victory in Europe in May 1945 and what soldiers had experienced during the Battle of the Bulge was stark. As Americans celebrated in warm spring weather, veterans of the Ardennes carried within them the memory of that frozen hell. Many found it difficult to celebrate, knowing how many of their comrades lay buried in Belgian soil, victims of German aggression and nature's cruelty combined. The legacy of the Battle of the Bulge extends beyond military history. It stands as a testament to human endurance under the most extreme conditions. It shows what ordinary people are capable of when pushed to their absolute limits. It demonstrates both the best and worst of humanity, the capacity for sacrifice and survival alongside the horror of war and suffering. Veterans of the battle often struggled to explain to those who hadn't been there what it was like. How do you describe cold so intense it feels like burning? How do you explain the desperation of trying to stay warm when warmth seems like a distant memory? How do you convey the moral weight of deciding whether to share your last pair of dry socks when keeping them might mean the difference between keeping or losing your feet? William Crawford, a veteran of the 1st Infantry Division, spent years trying to write about his experiences, but found words inadequate. He would start sentences about the cold and then stop, frustrated by the inability of language to convey the reality. He finally wrote simply that the cold was like death itself, creeping through their positions, claiming victims with a patience and inevitability that made German attacks seem almost merciful by comparison. At least with the Germans, you could fight back. The Battle of the Bulge has been studied extensively by military historians, but the role of weather as a combatant in its own right is often understated. The cold didn't choose sides, but it shaped every aspect of the battle. It influenced tactical decisions, affected strategy, and ultimately contributed to the German failure. The Wehrmacht's inability to maintain momentum in the face of both American resistance and brutal weather conditions doomed their offensive. German General Hasso von Manteuffel, commander of the 5th Panzer Army during the offensive, later admitted that they had underestimated both American resilience and the impact of the weather. He described watching his elite units, veterans of the Eastern Front, being stopped, not just by American forces, but by snowdrifts, ice and cold that immobilized vehicles and men alike. The weather, he said, was like a third army on the battlefield, one that neither side could defeat or ally with. The stories of survival from the Battle of the Bulge became legendary within military circles. Units that had maintained cohesion and effectiveness despite the cold became case studies in leadership and endurance. The defense of Bastogne in particular became a symbol of American determination. The image of paratroopers holding out in the snow, surrounded but unbroken, became iconic. But behind the legend were thousands of individual stories of suffering and survival that were far less glamorous. Private Dale Wilson of the 101st Airborne, one of the defenders of Bastogne, later reflected on the mythology that grew up around the battle. Yes, he said, they had held out against the Germans. Yes, they had refused to surrender. But what he remembered most was not the heroism but the misery. He remembered men crying from the pain of frostbite, the smell of gangrene in aid stations, the sound of frozen bodies being stacked like firewood. The victory, he said, came at a price that only those who paid it could truly understand. As the years passed and veterans aged, many found themselves returning to the Ardennes, trying to make sense of what they had experienced. They would stand in peaceful forests, now regrown and beautiful, trying to reconcile the tranquil present with the frozen hell of their memories. Some found peace in these visits. Others found that the memories were too strong, that every snow-covered tree still held the potential for death. Every cold wind still carried the sounds of dying men. James Patterson returned to the Ardennes in 1994, 50 years after the battle. He stood in a field near Malmedy, where he had nearly died, where he had lost 3 toes to frostbite and his best friend to a German shell. The field was peaceful, covered in wildflowers, with no sign of the violence that had occurred there. He broke down crying, not from sadness, but from a kind of cognitive dissonance, unable to reconcile the beauty before him with the horror in his memory. His grandson, who had accompanied him, didn't understand until Patterson explained that in his mind, this field was still covered in snow and blood, still echoing with the screams of dying men. The Battle of the Bulge remains the largest battle ever fought by the United States Army. The casualties, including those 19,000 deaths, represent the high watermark of American sacrifice in the European theater. But statistics cannot capture the individual suffering, the personal tragedies, the thousands of stories of young men who faced death, not just from enemy action, but from the merciless cold that turned the Ardennes forest into a frozen killing ground. Today, when we think of the Battle of the Bulge, we often focus on the strategic victory, the German defeat, the heroism of units like the 101st Airborne. But we should also remember the individual soldier, trembling in his foxhole, his feet numb, his fingers too cold to work his rifle, watching his breath freeze in the air while wondering if he would live to see another dawn. We should remember that while families gathered around warm hearths, that Christmas of 1944, their sons and brothers were dying in the snow, victims of both war and weather. Then, the title of the bloodiest battle in American military history belongs to the Battle of the Bulge, not just because of the numbers, but because of the conditions under which it was fought. It was a battle against two enemies, the German Wehrmacht and the Belgian winter, and both extracted a terrible toll. The 19,000 Americans who died in that frozen forest paid the ultimate price for victory. Their sacrifice made all the more poignant by the conditions under which they died. The last word should go to the veterans themselves. As one survivor put it, they didn't die heroically like in the movies. They died cold, afraid, and far from home. They died calling for their mothers, their wives, their God. They died with their blood freezing before it could soak into the ground. They died as young men have always died in war, but with the added cruelty of a cold that made their last moments an agony of freezing and fear. They deserve to be remembered not as statistics, but as individuals who endured unimaginable suffering in the service of their country and the cause of freedom. The Battle of the Bulge ended 79 years ago, but its lessons remain relevant. It reminds us of the cost of freedom, paid in blood and suffering by young men who faced not just human enemies, but nature itself turned hostile. It reminds us that victory in war comes not from weapons and strategy alone, but from the willingness of ordinary people to endure extraordinary hardship. And it reminds us that behind every military victory lie thousands of individual tragedies, each one a universe of suffering that statistics can never fully capture.